The line of them stretched from her gate clear back to the bend in the road, a shuffling, silent testament to the brittleness of pride. Their faces were masks of dust and worry, their eyes fixed on the wicker basket in Elspeth's arms. The eggs inside were cool and heavy, smooth as river stones, their shells the color of cream in deep shade. Behind her, from the green basin that cupped the only real water left in the county, came the contented murmur of her flock, a sound as alien in the parched landscape as a hymn in a saloon. Silas Croft stood near the front, his merchant's suit hanging loose on a frame thinned by the same hardship as everyone else, though he tried to hide it with a posture of authority. He had come not to buy, but to watch her fail, to see her gouge or gloat or break under the pressure of their collective, hungry gaze. He wanted to be able to say, "See, I told you, a woman alone cannot manage such a thing. She is selfish. She is weak." It was all there in the tight set of his jaw. Elspeth met his eyes for a brief, steady moment, then looked past him to the tired face of Mrs. Gable, a woman whose charity had always been laced with pity. Elspeth lifted the first egg from the basket. It was not a victory she felt, not the hot flush of vindication. It was the quiet, solid weight of responsibility, heavy and real as the egg in her palm. It was the simple arithmetic of survival, a math she had been practicing alone in the dark for 2 years. 2 springs earlier, the land was all she had. A quarter section nobody wanted, inherited from a great uncle she'd never met. The town of promise had judged it, and her, in a single glance. The soil was thin, stony, and worst of all, it fell away into a wide, shallow basin that held water for a week after a hard rain and then became a slick, cracked pan of useless clay for the rest of the year. A mud hole with a deed, Mr. Gable had pronounced from his wagon seat, not unkindly. "You'd have done better to sell the paper it's written on." Elspeth had just nodded, her hands tucked into the pockets of her worn dress. She had $4, a sack of flour, and a stubbornness so deep it was more like a feature of the landscape than a quality of her character. She spent the first weeks walking the property from sunup to sundown, learning its language. She saw where the wind had scoured the earth and where it had left drifts of precious topsoil. She saw the kind of weeds that grew in the damp spots and the kind that clung to the dry ridges. She saw that the basin, for all its ugliness, was the lowest point for miles. One afternoon, after a vicious thunderstorm that turned the road to a river of mud, she was clearing a choked ditch along the property line when she saw it. A tiny, bedraggled tuft of brown fluff, half submerged and trembling. A duckling, separated from its mother and washed away by the torrent. It was so weak it could barely lift its head. The town would have called it a mercy to leave it. It was one more mouth, one more useless creature on a useless patch of land. Elspeth knelt in the mud, her skirt soaking through, and gently scooped the bird into her hands. It was lighter than a handful of air. She tucked it inside her jacket, against the warmth of her skin, and carried it home. The duckling, which she simply called one, lived in a box by the stove, its peeps the only sound in the small, quiet cabin. Elspeth fed it mashed corn and grubs she dug from the softer soil near the basin, and its trembling subsided, replaced by a fierce, demanding hunger. Within a week, it was toddling around the cabin floor, a tiny, self-important shadow at her heels. When she took it to the mercantile for a small bag of cracked corn, Mrs. Gable had clucked her tongue. "Still got that thing, do you?" "Elspeth, dear, it's a mud duck. It'll eat you out of house and home and give you nothing back for it. Not like a good laying hen." Elspeth just paid her nickel and left. She did not explain that she had watched the chickens all over the county, pecking in the dusty, barren yards, and had seen how the summer heat laid them low, how they stopped laying when the grasshoppers descended. She had read in her great-uncle's old almanac that some ducks, the right kind of ducks, foraged for themselves and laid an egg nearly every day, heat or no heat. It was a long shot, a hope as fragile as the duckling had been. While one grew its down giving way to sleek, brown feathers, Elspeth began to work on the basin. The town saw her digging in the mud and shook their heads. The poor woman, touched by loneliness and grief. She started at the lowest point, not digging down but scraping away. She used a flat spade to peel back the layers of dried, cracked silt, exposing the dense, gray clay beneath. Day after day, she worked, her hands cracking, her back a solid wall of fire. She wasn't just digging a hole. She was shaping a vessel. She remembered something an old farmer had told her father once, a man from the old country with eyes the color of a winter sky. Mr. Abramoff. He lived on a small plot 2 miles away. She walked there one evening, the young duck waddling behind her. He was sitting on his porch, carving a piece of wood. He watched her approach, his eyes missing nothing. "You are the girl with the bad land," he said. It was not a judgment, but a fact. "They say you dig in the mud. I'm making a pond," Elspeth said. He stopped carving. "The basin holds water, but it seeps away. The clay underneath, it's like a bowl. If I can expose enough of it and pack it, maybe it will hold." The old man looked at her for a long time, then at the duck, who was busily investigating a beetle near the porch steps. He nodded slowly. The water knows. Water always remembers the way down. If you give it a good place to stay, it will stay." He squinted at the sky. It is a good thing to have a place for water to stay. It was all the encouragement she needed. That single word, was more valuable to her than all the pitying advice from the town of promise. She went back to her work with a renewed fire. She dug and scraped and hauled, using a wheelbarrow to move the silted topsoil to a spot where she hoped to one day have a garden. She was creating the one thing the rest of the county, with its sun-baked farmyards and shallow wells, was slowly losing, a deep, reliable pool of life. By June, one was a full-grown duck, sleek and handsome with an iridescent green head. A drake. Elspeth felt a pang of disappointment. A drake would lay no eggs. The town's judgment seemed to settle over her again. All that work for a single, useless bird. But one seemed content. He spent his days foraging in the damp edges of the half-finished pond, and Elspeth, despite her pragmatism, had grown fond of his quiet companionship. One morning, she woke to a strange sound, a chorus of soft quacking from outside the cabin. She opened the door and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. There, waddling behind one, as if he were a king leading a procession, were 7 other ducks. They were brown and plain, leaner than the wild mallards that sometimes pass through. They looked at her with bright, intelligent eyes, unafraid. He had gone out and brought back a flock. The town found it hilarious. Elspeth's mud duck army, Mr. Gable called it, laughing into his coffee at the mercantile. First she digs a mud hole, now she fills it with mud ducks. At least they'll match. Elspeth ignored them. She knew what she had. She had looked them up in the almanac. Khaki Campbells, famous for their eggs. Her gamble, the one she thought she had lost, had returned to her 7-fold. Now, the work on the pond became urgent. The small pool of rainwater from spring would not be enough for 8 birds through the dry summer. She worked with a frantic energy, her muscles screaming in protest. She dug a trench from the gully where the rainwater ran off the road, directing the flow toward her basin. She packed the clay sides with her bare feet, stomping and smoothing until the surface was slick and impermeable. Mr. Abramoff came by one afternoon, carrying a small sack. He didn't say a word, just watch her work for a few minutes. Then he handed her the sack. Inside were barley seeds. For the edges, he said, the roots will hold the soil. The ducks will eat the seeds. Nothing is wasted. He looked at the flock, which was dabbling happily in the growing pond. They're good birds. They find their own way. His validation was like a cool drink of water. It washed away the dust of the town's mockery and settled deep in her bones. She worked until twilight each day, and as she worked, she did the arithmetic. 8 ducks. If even half were hens, and they laid as the book said, that was 4 eggs a day. 28 eggs a week. Enough for her to eat, with plenty left over. If they were all hens, she didn't dare to hope. The numbers were a prayer she recited in the quiet of her cabin, a shield against the doubt that sometimes crept in like the evening chill. She was one person, alone, on a patch of scorned earth. But now, she was not entirely alone. She had a flock, and she had a growing belief, fragile but persistent, that the thing everyone else saw as a flaw, the low, water-gathering basin, was in fact her single greatest asset. She was learning to read the land not for what it was, but for what it could become. The first egg appeared on a morning crisp with the promise of summer heat. It was nestled in a clutch of reeds at the pond's edge, larger than a chicken's egg, with a shell the color of pale jade. Elspeth picked it up, its weight surprising her. It felt solid, substantial. She carried it back to the cabin like a jewel, cradling it in her hands. That morning, she fried it in her last bit of lard. The yolk was a deep, fiery orange, and it tasted of the rich things the ducks foraged for, clover and worms and watercress. It was the best thing she had ever eaten. Soon, there were more. 3 of the ducks were hens, and they were relentless layers. Every morning, Elspeth would find 3 new eggs in the reeds. The arithmetic was working. 21 eggs a week. She kept her success quiet, a secret held close like a coal banked low under ash. To the town, she was still just a lonely woman with a mud hole and the useless ducks. They did not see the growing pile of eggs in her cool cellar, each one a small victory. It was a boy named Finn who first discovered her secret. He was the Gable's youngest, a scrawny, quiet child of about 10 with eyes that saw everything and a mouth that said little. He started appearing at the edge of her property, watching the ducks for hours, silent as a fence post. Elspeth left him be. One day, he approached as she was collecting the eggs. "You get a lot," he said, his first words to her. "3 a day," she replied, not wanting to encourage him, but not wanting to be unkind. "That one," he pointed at the drake, "he's the general." He brought the others. Elspeth smiled. "I suppose he is from then on." Finn was a regular presence. He helped her scatter barley for the ducks. He gave them all names. The general, of course, and the 3 hens became Pip, Mabel, and Duck. He had a solemn dignity that she appreciated. He never asked for anything, but she started giving him an egg to take home now and then. His mother, Mrs. Gable, accepted it with a tight, suspicious look as if it might be poisoned. "You're sure they're all right to eat?" she'd asked. "They eat mud and bugs. They're fine," Elspeth had said, her voice even. The pond was nearly finished now. It was 100 feet across, maybe 5 feet at its deepest, and the clay bottom held the water like a cupped hand. The barley had sprouted, creating a fringe of green around the edges. It was an oasis in the increasingly dry landscape. By August, the heat was a physical presence, a weight that settled over the county. The creeks slowed to a trickle. The grass in the pastures turned the color of old straw. The hens in town stopped laying altogether. But Pip, Mabel, and Dot laid their 3 eggs every single morning, cool and perfect in the reeds. Elspeth's cellar was overflowing. She knew she had to sell them. She couldn't eat them all, and she needed money for winter supplies. With a knot of anxiety in her stomach, she loaded 2 dozen into a basket and walked to the Saturday market in town. Her stall was at the far end of the market, next to the man who sold questionable tonics. The farmers' wives with their dusty-looking chickens and small, precious clutches of eggs looked at her basket with disdain. The few shoppers who passed by glanced at the large, greenish-white eggs and hurried on. They were strange. They were different. They were from the mud duck farm. Hours passed. The sun beat down. Elspeth stood with quiet resolve, refusing to let her disappointment show. Being right was its own kind of reply, but it paid no bills. Just as she was about to pack up, a buggy pulled up, a fancy one from the city. A man in a chef's coat, startlingly white in the dusty street, stepped out. He moved with an air of brisk impatience, scanning the market stalls with a critical eye. This was Chef Antoine from the Gilded Plate, the new restaurant at the hotel that catered to railroad men and land speculators. He stopped at her stall, his gaze falling on the eggs. "Duck eggs," he said, his voice clipped with a French accent. "How much?" 10 cents a dozen, Elspeth said. He raised an eyebrow. "That is very cheap. Are they fresh?" "This morning," she said. He picked one up, weighing it in his hand. He held it up to the light. "The shell is thick. This is good." He looked at her, his eyes sharp. "The chickens, they do not lay in this heat. But the ducks, they do not care, eh? Let me see 1 inch." Elspeth took an egg from her basket and, using the edge of the wooden table, cracked it cleanly into a small bowl she had brought. The yolk sat high and proud, a perfect dome of deep, rich orange. A collective gasp came from the nearby farmers' wives. Their pale yellow chicken yolks looked watery and sad in comparison. Chef Antoine stared into the bowl for a long moment. He dipped a finger into the yolk and tasted it. His eyes widened slightly. "Mon Dieu, et oui spelled. He looked up at Elspeth. His entire demeanor changed. He was no longer a skeptical buyer. He was a man who had found treasure. I will take all you have, he said, and I will take all you can give me every week, but not for 10 cents. That is an insult. I will pay 25 cents a dozen. A wave of murmurs went through the market. 25 cents a dozen was a fortune. Elspeth simply nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. She packed the 2 dozen eggs for him. He paid her in silver, the coins cool and heavy in her palm. As he was leaving, he turned back. You, what is your name? Elspeth, Elspeth, he repeated. You do not know what you have here. These are not eggs. They are gold. He drove off, leaving Elspeth standing in a pool of stunned silence. The town of promise had seen. The mockery was over. Now, something new and perhaps more dangerous was beginning. Envy. The silver coins in her pocket were the first tangible proof that her gamble was paying off. It wasn't just the money. It was the validation from an outsider, someone whose judgment wasn't clouded by town gossip and long-held prejudice. The walk home felt different. The land didn't seem quite as harsh, the sun not as punishing. But the stares she got as she left the market were a new kind of currency, too. They were no longer looks of pity, but of calculation. A thing is only worth what others will pay, and Chef Antoine had just set a very high price on her mud ducks. The first person to try and collect on that price was Silas Croft. He was the town's grain dealer, a councilman, and a man who had built a small empire by buying low and selling high. He saw opportunity in everything, from a farmer's bad luck to a widow's desperation. He arrived at her farm the following week, not in his work wagon, but in his Sunday buggy, as if paying a social call. He tied his horse to her fence and walked toward the pond, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. Miss Elspeth, he said, his voice smooth as cream. A remarkable bit of engineering you have here. Truly, Elspeth, who was reinforcing a section of the bank, did not stop her work. She just nodded a greeting. Mr. Croft, I was at the market, he continued, strolling around the pond's edge, his eyes scanning everything. I heard about your arrangement with a hotel. A fine piece of business. A very fine piece of business for a young woman on her own. The condescension was subtle, wrapped in a compliment. The ducks do the work, she said, tamping the clay with the back of her spade. Ah, but it takes a clever mind to see the potential, he purred. And that's what I've come to talk about. Potential. You have a fine product, but a limited market. I, on the other hand, have wagons that go to the city every week. I have contacts. I can move your entire supply, guarantee you a steady price. He stopped and faced her, his smile wide and benevolent. I'm prepared to offer you 12 cents a dozen for every egg your flock can produce. It's a fair price, a guaranteed income. Takes all the worry off your shoulders. Elspeth finally stopped working and looked at him. The arithmetic clicked through her head. He was offering her less than half of what Chef Antoine was paying, intending to sell them himself for a massive profit. He was counting on her being ignorant or desperate or too timid to refuse. No, thank you, Mr. Croft, she said, her voice calm and even. I have an arrangement that I'm happy with. Croft's smile tightened at the edges. Now, Elspeth, let's be practical. You can't rely on a temperamental city chef. He could change his mind tomorrow. A woman alone needs security. I'm offering you security. I'm secure enough, she said. The politeness in his face vanished, replaced by a flicker of irritation. You're being foolish. You have a small flock, a puddle of water. What happens when the drought truly sets in? Your pond will dry up. Your ducks will stop laying or wander off. You'll be left with nothing. My offer is your only sensible choice. The pond won't dry up, she said. It was a statement of fact, born of 2 years of observation and backbreaking labor. She knew how deep the clay went. She knew how little it evaporated compared to the shallow creeks. He saw the stillness in her, the absolute lack of fear or doubt, and it angered him. Have it your way, he snapped, his voice losing its creamy smoothness. But when you come begging for feed this winter, remember this conversation. He turned and strode back to his buggy, his boots making angry prints in the soft earth. Elspeth watched him go, a cold knot forming in her stomach. He had not been offering a partnership. He had been issuing a threat. The drought did not break. August arrived like the open door of a furnace, and September was no better. The sky remained a pale, cloudless blue, day after day. The creeks that fed the town's wells vanished, leaving behind cracked, stony beds. The corn in the fields turned brown and brittle before the ears could fill out. The Gables well went dry, then the Millers. A quiet desperation began to settle over the town of promise. People's faces grew tighter, their words shorter. The only place that seemed immune was Elspeth's farm. Her pond, fed by the deep clay basin's memory of every rainstorm for a century, had dropped less than a foot. The green barley around its edges was a shock of color in the beige landscape. And the ducks, her flock now grown to 12 with a new generation of ducklings, were thriving. Pip, Mabel, and Dot, joined now by 3 younger hens, kept laying their 6 eggs every single day. The weekly income from Chef Antoine was a steady lifeline. Elspeth used the money not for herself, but to prepare. She bought sacks of grain and corn from a dealer in the next county, avoiding Silas Croft's resentful gaze. She stockpiled flour, salt, and beans. She worked on the coop she had built, insulating it with sod and straw for the coming winter. She did her arithmetic in the evenings by lamplight. So many eggs per week. So much money. So many weeks until the first snow. She was an island of methodical preparation in a sea of mounting panic. The town's attitude toward her shifted again. The envy was still there, but it was now curdled with a dark resentment. Whispers followed her when she went to the mercantile. How did she have water when no one else did? It wasn't right. That land was flawed, cursed. Now it seemed blessed, and that felt like a betrayal. They had pitted her, then mocked her, then envied her. Now, they were beginning to fear her. Or rather, they feared their own lack in the face of her abundance. Finn was her only regular visitor. He seemed to find a peace at her pond that was absent in the tense, worried atmosphere of the town. He helped her harvest the barley heads, his small hands quick and nimble. Pa says Mr. Croft says you're hoarding, he said one afternoon, not looking at her. He says you're getting rich while the town starves, am I? Elspeth asked quietly. Finn shook his head, his eyes on the ducks. No, you just work hard, and you were smart about the water. It was the highest compliment she had ever received. But Croft's poison was spreading. He was a man who could not stand to be proven wrong, especially by a woman he had dismissed as helpless. He began to frame Elspeth's success as a crime against the community. He spoke of the common good and the need for shared resources in a time of crisis. He was no longer trying to buy her eggs. He was trying to take them. He wanted to turn the town against her, to use their fear and hunger as a weapon. One evening, she found footprints near the coop. Not Finn's small ones, but a man's heavy boots. And the next morning, when she did her count, she was 1 hen short. That was gone. A cold, hard anger, something she hadn't felt before, settled in her heart. This was no longer about business. It was about survival. The theft of the hen was a declaration of war. Elspeth knew who was behind it. It wasn't just a hungry neighbor. The act was too pointed, too symbolic. It was Croft, using someone to send a message. Your prosperity is not your own. It can be taken. She spent the day securing the coop, reinforcing the latch, her movements precise and angry. When Finn arrived that afternoon, he found her driving stakes into the ground for a new fence. He looked toward the pond. That's gone, he said. He knew the ducks as well as she did. Yes, Elspeth said, her voice tight. Mr. Croft was talking to my pa again last night. Finn said, his own voice small. He said there's a town council meeting. He said they're going to talk about the emergency water rights. He said your pond is a public nuisance and a private hoard. The words hung in the dry air. A public nuisance. Her beautiful, life-giving pond. Elspeth stopped her work, the hammer heavy in her hand. Croft was moving to make his theft legal. He would use the law, twist it with the town's fear, and take everything she had built. She looked at her flock, dabbling peacefully in the water. She looked at the sturdy cabin, the neat woodpile, the cellar full of food and eggs. She had done all this herself, with her own 2 hands and her own mind. She had taken a piece of worthless land and a half-drowned bird and created abundance. And he was going to stand up in front of everyone and call it a crime. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat at her small table, the arithmetic running through her head, but it was a different kind of math now. It was the calculus of community, of pride, and of hunger. Hunger changes a town. It makes good people desperate and cruel men bold. She could fight him. She could hire a lawyer with her egg money, stand on her rights, on her deed. But she would be alone, against the council, against the town. One person alone. Or she could do something else. The next morning, she collected the 5 eggs from the remaining hens. She packed them carefully in her basket. She found Finn waiting for her by the road. "I'm going to the meeting," she said. He just nodded and fell into step beside her. The meeting was in the church, the only building large enough to hold the crowd. The air inside was thick with heat and anxiety. Silas Croft stood at the front, looking solemn and important. He was speaking as Elspeth and Finn slipped into a back pew. "A matter of public survival," Croft was saying, his voice resonating with false sympathy. "We cannot stand by while one individual hoards the single most precious resource, water, for the benefit of a few commercial ducks, while our own wells are dry and our livestock is dying." He let his words sink in. "I propose the council declare the basin on the old Miller property a temporary public water asset, to be managed for the good of all." He was met with a murmur of agreement. People were scared. He was offering them an easy solution, an easy villain. The council chairman, a nervous man named Peters, looked out at the crowd. "Does anyone wish to speak to this?" There was a long silence. Then, from the back, Elspeth's voice came, clear and steady. "Edo." Every head in the church turned. Elspeth walked slowly up the center aisle, Finn a few steps behind her. She did not look angry or afraid. She looked like what she was, a woman who had come from her morning's work. She stopped in front of the council table, placing her basket of 5 eggs on it. She looked not at Croft, but at the faces of the townspeople she knew. The Gables, the Millers, the blacksmith, the mercantile owner. "Mr. Croft speaks of hoarding," she began, her voice quiet but carrying in the still room. "He speaks as if I've taken something from you. But this pond, this water, it was never yours to begin with. It was part of a piece of land none of you wanted. You called a mud hole, a flaw." She paused, letting them remember their own words. "I did not take water from the town. I made a place for the water to stay. The water that would have otherwise run into a ditch and disappeared. I used my own labor on my own land. That is not hoarding. That is husbandry," Silas Croft scoffed. "Husbandry for a flock of ducks you sell to a fancy city restaurant. What about the people of promise? What have you done for them?" Elspeth met his gaze. "Let's talk about that. You seem to know a lot about my business, Mr. Croft. You talk about my flock. How many laying hens do I have?" Croft was momentarily flustered. "Well, a half dozen perhaps. The number is not the point. The number is precisely the point," Elspeth said, her voice sharp as steel. "Until yesterday, I had 4. Pip, Mabel, Dot, and 3 younger ones. 6 total. But that was stolen from her locked coop 2 nights ago. So now I have 5, which is why there are only 5 eggs in this basket this morning." She looked directly at Croft. "How did you know my count, Mr. Croft? How did you know how many eggs I sell, or how many ducks I have? Have you been watching my farm that closely?" A different kind of murmur went through the crowd. Suspicion. Croft's face paled, then flushed with anger. "That's an outrageous accusation." "Is it?" Elspeth turned back to the town. "You are hungry. You are thirsty. I understand that. But taking what is mine will not solve your problems for long. My pond is not a miracle. It is a clay bowl I spent a year digging. It is finite. If you drain it for your cattle, it will be gone in a month. And then what? You will be thirsty again, and I will have nothing." She took a breath. "There is another way. Starting tomorrow morning, my gate will be open. Anyone who needs water for their household, for drinking, for cooking, for washing, can come and take what they need. 2 buckets per family, per day. No charge." A wave of stunned silence swept the room. "For livestock," she continued, "I cannot provide for free, but I will not see them die. I will sell water for a penny a bucket. The same price Mr. Croft charges for a cup of feed." The shot was direct, and everyone knew it. Croft's prices had doubled since the drought began. "And eggs," she said, her voice softening. "I know your hens are not laying. I will set aside half my eggs for the town. I will not charge you 25 cents. I will sell them for 10 cents, the same price I started with. Or I will trade them for firewood, for mending, for help strengthening the coop. We will all get through this winter, but we will do it by working together, not by theft and fear." She stood in the silence, her proposal hanging in the air. It was generous, it was fair, and it completely dismantled Croft's narrative of her as a greedy hoarder. It recast her not as a problem, but as the center of the solution. The silence in the church stretched, thick and profound. It was broken by Mr. Gable, a man not known for his eloquence. He stood up, his hat in his hands, and looked at Elspeth. That's more than fair," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He glanced at Silas Croft, a look of dawning comprehension on his face. He, like everyone else, had been swept up in Croft's tide of fear and resentment. Now, in the clear light of Elspeth's calm generosity, it all looked shabby and false. Mrs. Gable pulled a handkerchief from her sleeve and dabbed at her eyes. She was looking at the boy, Finn, who stood beside Elspeth, his small shoulders squared with pride. One by one, others in the room nodded. The blacksmith cleared his throat. "I've got a cord of oak, split and seasoned. Be glad to trade for eggs for my family," a woman from the back called out. "I commend Elspeth. I'm good with a needle." The tension in the room broke, replaced by a flood of relief and cooperation. They had been shown a way out of their desperation that did not involve becoming thieves. Silas Croft stood alone at the front, his face a mask of fury. He had lost. He had been outmaneuvered not by clever legal arguments or threats, but by simple, open-handed decency. He had tried to make the town hungry enough to be cruel, and Elspeth had offered them a way to be fed and remain good. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the church, the door slamming behind him. His power, which had been built on the town's dependency, had vanished in an instant. The next morning, the line began to form at her gate, just as she had foreseen in her sleepless night. But it was not a mob. It was a procession of neighbors. They came with buckets and wagons, with bundles of mending and promises of work. They were quiet, respectful, almost humbled. Elspeth stood at the gate, Finn beside her with a ledger to keep track of the trades. She greeted each person by name. She did not gloat. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply filled their buckets from the pond and traded her precious eggs for their promises. She was no longer Elspeth, the lonely woman with the mud hole. She was Elspeth of the duck pond, the woman who had understood the land when no one else had. The drought held on for another month, but the spirit of the town had changed. The quiet desperation was replaced by a sense of shared purpose. The men who came for water often stayed to help her reinforce the pond banks. The women who traded for eggs brought loaves of bread or jars of preserves from last year's harvest. The community, which had been fracturing under the strain of hardship, was slowly being woven back together, with Elspeth's farm at its center. The rains finally came in late October, a slow, soaking drizzle that lasted for 3 days. The whole town smelled of wet earth and release. The creeks began to run again, but people still came to Elspeth for eggs. Her ducks were still the only reliable layers, and the rich, orange-yolked eggs had become a staple, a symbol of resilience. One afternoon, as the low winter sun cast long shadows, Mr. Abramov came to visit. He and Elspeth stood by the edge of the pond, which was full to the brim, the water clear and calm. The flock, now nearly 24 strong, dabbled happily. "The water came back," Elspeth said. The old man nodded, a small smile on his face. "Duh. It always remembers the way down." He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, quiet respect. "And a good heart. It always remembers the way up." Elspeth watched the general marshal his flock, his green head gleaming in the fading light. She had started with nothing but a piece of scorned land and a belief in the hidden logic of the world. She had faced mockery, envy, and theft, and had met it all with quiet work and stubborn grace. She had learned the arithmetic of survival, but the most important lesson was the one she had taught the town, that the best measure of wealth is not what you can hoard, but what you can share. And in the green basin that cupped the heart of her farm, the water and the life it sustained stayed.